So long to Doc, Earl, and Doug. Give sorrow words, the poet advised. But it's not an easy thing to do in this year when we have experienced the passing away of some of the greats of our music. That thing always comes as a shock. You know not the hour, as the Bible says. 2012 has been the year of the passing of some of our music's monumental figures. Especially for me, Doc Watson, Earl Scruggs, and Doug Dillard, as well as some other greats of our music, including Everett Lilly. Sic transit gloria mundi. Thus passes away the glory of the world. And so we grieve for these giant figures in our lives and our music. We sure feel their absence. We make speeches, we write memorials, and as the character in the play said, as they gathered around the deathbed of Richard II, "For God's sake, let us sit down upon the ground and tell sad tales of the death of kings." The tales of Doc and Earl and Doug will be many to tell, and in fact they already have been. Happily, these great players did actually receive some of their flowers while they were living, as the old Stanley Brothers song has it. Earl Scruggs seemed to come out of nowhere in the 1940s, playing a style of banjo that was, by the time the world heard it, so complete, so powerful, that all banjo playing since then has been judged by its standard. The old tapes of the Bluegrass Boys on the 1940s Grand Ole Opry record how audiences just went berserk for Earl's banjo, demanding so many encores it almost stopped the rest of the show. When Doc Watson burst on the national scene in those early 60s Newport folk festivals, he blew the New England folkies away with the power of his gravel-pure voice and the greatest guitar flat-picking that had ever been heard. And when Doc and son Merle toured the world starting in the late 60s, they began the biggest migration of a single musical instrument in history. The steel string guitar went from deep obscurity in the mid-20th century to become, in the hands of Doc and Merle, the most ubiquitous instrument on earth. Out of all the sincere and well-intentioned attempts of politics, diplomacy, philosophy, religion, and education to get people to be peaceable together, ironically today, one of the last things on earth that all 7 billion of us agree on is that everybody seems to like the steel string guitar. So if you could get into Tehran or Beijing or Mogadishu today, there would probably be somewhere in those places a peaceable jam session, and someone there would probably know the wildwood flower. So having thus swept the world, guitar music might just maybe someday save humanity. And if it does, Doc and Merle started that trend. Doug Dillard was another tremendous personality and player, very influential, and with the Dillards Band came roaring out of the California music scene in the late 60s and early 70s. The Dillards showed the world that bluegrass music, acoustic instruments, and entertaining stories and repartee could make it on a major label and stand on its own, surrounded by electrified country and rock music. So it's shocking to think of our world without them. For me, Earl was the blazing banjo sound that first hooked me on bluegrass as a little kid in 1951. In my world, Doc Watson was the fifth face on the Mount Rushmore of music, and Doug was sassy, smart, old-time music walking unapologetically up and down Santa Monica Boulevard. Today, without them, the world feels a bit strange, and we wonder what more we can say about their absence. Books will be written, memorials created, and most of all, we will tell the stories of Doc and Earl and Doug for a long time. So what more is there to say? Well, just a couple of things more. One is to remind ourselves how their music and their example ought to influence us. In history, the great funeral orations were aimed not at the departed, but at the living. Pericles after the Peloponnesian War and Lincoln at Gettysburg, for example, reminded the living to carry on the vision of those being memorialized. And that's something we can do as we celebrate and feel the loss of Doc and Earl and Doug. We can go back to the source, listen again to the recordings, hear in Doc's singing and playing what Utah Phillips called the power of an authorless folk song. Listen to the beautiful inside stuff of Earl's banjo, the irony, the tone, the drive. and revisit those sessions from over 3 decades ago when Doug and the Dillards took bluegrass to town and made it dance in the city streets. And there's one other important tradition that these heroes of our music all taught us. It's the tradition of it's okay to do something different. Realize that the passing greats of 2012 are immortal and revered by us, both because they were true to their roots and traditions, and also because the music they actually performed changed everything that went before. Doc, Earl, Doug, all innovators who warped and altered the music drastically, while somehow never letting you forget where they and it came from. Now that's a difficult line to walk. Their legacy of rooted but different is a challenging course for us to navigate, and it can get divisive. And if you don't think so, just sit in on some of our beer and opinions arguments that we get into that range everywhere from bluegrasser than thou to it's my guitar and I'll play what I want to. It's a dialogue that is old as Western civilization. Will it be permanence or change? And the answer to that one, my friends, in our music had better be yes. The examples of Doc and Earl and Doug are a perfect guide into our future. They're a compass to keep the music on course in some sense, but also to point to the next Earl, Doc, or Doug, the next inspired young player waiting in the wings to knock your socks off. Think about it. Somewhere out there today, walking around, are the players who will be the heroes of 2062. So our job is twofold. We need to be the old curmudgeons, nagging the young players to remember the tradition, and then we need the wisdom to get out of their way as they change things, become Doc the Second, or the kid who will become Earl, or a Doug for the next generation. Because as Lee Hayes of the Weavers famously said, the future isn't what it was cracked up to be, and what more, it never was. I'm Dan Crary.